Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. Good evening, wherever you are. This is chapter 2 for our biology, and a lot of it is going to sound like what we talked about last year because now we're talking about chemistry. We briefly touch on chemistry every year in biology because it is a basic science. Everything that we will study in biology in the chapters to come will be based on chemistry. So we're just going to kind of remind you of all of that in this chapter, and then we won't do a lot specifically related to chemistry after this. So if you hate this chapter, there's good news. You won't have to hear a whole bunch of it. But as you recall, chemistry is the study of matter and how it changes, how it interacts. And that is a lot of what is happening in all living things. Every living thing is made up of matter. Anything, remember, that you can measure or sense, if it takes up space and has a volume, then it is matter. And so all living things are made of matter. We breathe in the air, which is matter. We eat food that is matter. We produce matter. So it is essential that we know a little bit more about what matter is. Of course, we've got atoms, and atoms are the basic building block of matter. They are the smallest stable particle, an individual particle of matter, and they are made up of three main parts. The protons are in the nucleus with a positive charge. The neutrons are also in the nucleus with a neutral charge. And then, of course, the electrons. They are negatively charged, and they are flying around the atom. So this picture should look, very familiar to you. You've seen that multiple times, and that is the basic structure. Obviously, the smaller parts are a big deal, but for us in the living things that we were talking about, these atoms are very stable. Now, atoms are held together because of that positive and negative charge, and of course that changes as we talked about last year. Okay, so these neutral atoms, they're neutral because they contain an equal number of protons and electrons. The positives and negatives equal 0. More often, naturally, you see ions, and these ions contain an unequal number of protons and electrons. And depending on if they're positive or negative, they have different names. You're going to have an anion, which is where you have more electrons. They have gained an electron from somewhere, and they have a negative charge. Or you have cations, and these have more protons than electrons because they have lost electrons, and they have an overall positive charge. So it's all about what the electrons are doing. And so you only can change the number of electrons and still have the same atom or the same element. If you change protons, it's a whole different set of things. Just for examples, chlorine is Cl, if you'll remember. It naturally tends to gain electrons in nature and become an anion. So very often you see it written as Cl with a little negative after it. Sodium, on the other hand, has a tendency to lose electrons. And so when it loses a negative, that's a minus, and so you end up with a positive. And so together, those two will bond and form NaCl, which of course is salt. Okay, so these elements, so they're classified by the number of protons that are in the nucleus. That is the atomic number. So I know it's tiny on this slide, but that little tiny number in the upper corner of each of those boxes, that is the atomic number. That is the number of protons. Elements are made up of only one type of atom, and they are identical to each other, at least as in the number of protons. Neutrons and electrons can change, but as long as protons are together, they are the same, then they are the same type of atom. The elements have been organized onto the periodic table, and it is a highly useful table just in terms of what it can tell you about each element. Now, so far, we have 90 naturally occurring elements, and as of today, we have 28 man-made elements. And so They are, again, what we are made of. Now, energy. So there are two things that were made, that God made in the beginning. He made matter and he made energy. So if we could sort everything into two big piles, we'd have a big pile of matter and a pile of energy. Now, energy is hard to define. It is the immaterial stuff that gets things done. I think that's how your book defined it. It's not something that I can hand you. And so it is necessary, obviously, for all of the stuff that we do, but it's a little bit harder to deal with because you can't see it. So it's all, kind of like we did last year in physical science. So for living things, nothing happens without energy. All living things use energy. All living things produce energy. And when I say produce, that doesn't mean they create it out of nothing. They take one form of energy and convert it into another, and that they convert it into a usable form. So that the word produce that I have there, don't let it throw you off and make you think, oh, I can make energy, because you can't. Okay, so energy comes in multiple forms: mechanical, acoustic, light, thermal, which is heat, electrical energy, chemical energy. For living things, we have to get energy from somewhere before we can produce it, before we can turn it into a form that is usable. And for us as people, that chemical energy mainly is going to come from the food that we eat. So you eat plants, hopefully you eat some veggies, you eat other animals, meat, and all those kinds of things. And so that is a form of chemical energy. Plants, on the other hand, absorb their energy, and they get that from the sun, and so that is their main source. But we both have to bring that energy in order to turn it into a form that is usable. Now, one thing to know about energy is that over time it tends to disperse. It tends to spread out, and that's because it's hard to store. Or some forms are hard to store, and so this is why you see decay. This is why you see things breaking down, because that energy can be very unstable. Okay, so hitting the highlights here. Remember stuff from last year. So changes in matter, you have physical changes, and this is where you don't change the matter's identity. Like, you can get it back if you needed to. So things like changing the shape or the size of a substance or an object, or changing the phase. That's a big one. If you melt it or boil it, if you freeze it. And so those happen all the time within nature and within your body, but also chemical changes. And this is where you do change the matter's identity. And these are a little bit more involved. They take more energy. You can't get the original substance back, which is a kind of a big deal in far of, just talking about how they change. But so if you, excuse me, my nose is itchy. If you ferment, if something rusts or oxidizes, burns, all those kinds of things are chemical change. For us, like for instance, digestion is a chemical change. You break down that substance that you have eaten into a totally different thing, and you're not getting it back. Okay, so now again, oh goodness, highlights. Compounds and molecules. So first off, these are bonded atoms in some cases, and the bonds are stored chemical energy, and they hold two or more atoms together. And this is the reason that we eat food. We're trying to get that energy out. So a compound is a pure substance. It's made of two or more elements that are chemically combined, and they always have to be combined in the proper ratio. We used the example water a lot last year when we talked about this. Water is always 2 H's and 1 O. I have rust on there on your screen. Rust is 2 irons and 3 oxygens. Now, compounds, you can have ionic compounds, and these are formed when electrons are transferred from one atom to another. So they are then positive. One is a cation because it has lost electrons, and one is an anion because it has gained. And so the positive and negative charges is what holds them together. We don't have tons of ionic compounds in our body, but our teeth and our bones are composed of these ionic compounds. When we're talking about ionic compounds, you always write them in kind of their reduced form. So you always write them in what is called the formula unit, and that's the smallest part of an ionic compound. Then you also have covalent compounds. This is what we are made up, the majority of us is made up of, and these are formed when electrons share. These are molecules. That's the smallest part, like the smallest written form of a covalent compound. Okay, so these chemical processes, so what are they doing for us, essentially? So first off, some of these physical changes that are important is our ability to use solutions or to make solutions. And so remember, a solution is when you have a substance being dissolved in another. And you have the solute that is being dissolved, the solvent that is doing the dissolving. And in nature, very often you see solutions that are made or maintained through diffusion. And diffusion is the dispersion of substances through Brownian motion. And Brownian motion is the tiny movement of individual particles that is caused by the collisions between those particles because they are vibrating. And so it is what helps to keep the solution kind of evenly distributed. And so again, it is something that happens within oceans and within your stomach, within your bloodstream. All of those are constantly keeping other things dissolved and proportional within the solution itself. That little picture over there is just a picture of a solution being formed. You may remember we talked about that last year, and is when solutions are formed, you just have that breakdown of a big substance, a big chunk of something into all of its individual pieces. Okay, so now chemical changes. So I've written some chemical equations on here. Remember, these are just the expression of the changes that are happening. That first equation is what your body does when it is breaking food down. This compound in the front here is glucose, and so that is a molecule that is our main source of energy. And so when it is broken down in the presence of oxygen, it will produce some water, which your body uses or you breathe out, CO2 again, which you get rid of, and then kind of the big thing that you're after, energy, and then your cells use that, and your body's able to do other things. One of the big things to know that when energy is produced, you have an exothermic reaction. Now, the other reaction that I have written on there, if you look at it closely, you'll notice it is pretty much the opposite. It is the reverse of the above reaction. And I've simplified it some, but this is basically what happens when a plant converts energy, sun energy, into a substance that we eat. And so here is that sun energy, and they use our CO2 that we breathed out. They get water from the ground or from the atmosphere, and they produce for us in its simplest form a glucose molecule. And so when you eat a plant, then you get that energy out. They also, as a byproduct, produce some oxygen, which we also really appreciate. Now, if you notice on this reaction, the energy is a reactant, and that means you have an endothermic reaction. Now, the other thing to know about chemical reactions is in order for them to happen, in order for them to get started, they have to get up to a certain energy level. They have to have a certain amount of energy going in, and that is called the activation energy. So over in those little tiny graphs over there, the hill that they have to get up, so the big bump right there, they have to get up to the top of that bump in order to kind of slide back down and get to the products. This activation energy is sometimes huge. An enormous amount of energy might need to be gained in order for reaction to happen, and that's just hard for living things to deal with because it takes a long time. And so we have some shortcuts that we take, and those come in the form of catalysts. Now, a catalyst is a substance that provides an alternative route, a detour basically, to get from reactants to products, and it doesn't require as much activation energy. So on that little graph, the blue dotted line that you see there, so that blue dotted line, oops, that's the tall line, as it goes up, you don't have a catalyst, and then the smaller hill, the little red, oh gosh, my little dot doesn't go right there. The smaller hill is with the catalyst, so it's a much lower amount of energy. They don't affect the products that are formed. They don't affect the amount of energy that is produced in the reaction. They just help it happen faster. Now, in your body, these catalysts are called enzymes. And enzymes are naturally produced. They are things that help you maybe digest food more easily, but they make the process faster. Lots of people, if you have, like if you're intolerant to certain foods and those kinds of things, lots of times it's because your enzymes, you don't produce the proper enzymes. Now, these enzymes, how they work, they speed up the reaction by either, like I said, lowering that activation energy, the hill, or they can even lower the temperature needed for a reaction. And what happens is the reactants, the things that you're starting with, attach to the enzyme in a very specific spot, and this is called the active site. So if you look at this little picture right here, it is basically showing these steps. So the blue substance is the enzyme, the green is the reactant. It's called a substrate because, science, we have words for everything. And it will attach, it has a very specific shape, so it will fit into the enzyme. And then as the enzyme helps it reach the activation energy, that reactant is broken apart into its two products. So that's the A and the B, the yellow and the little purple. And the enzyme, noticed, stays exactly the same. It is not used, changed, nothing happens to it. It's just where the reaction happens. Now, in some cases, you have substances called inhibitors, and they will stop the reaction or slow it down at least because they basically get in the way. They bind to the catalyst's active site, and they don't allow the real substrate to get in. So in the other little picture, the little green shape, it will fit right down into that active site, the little triangle, but notice it's not what should be there, and it will just stay in that site and prevent the reaction from happening. Okay, so now on to biochemistry. So what compounds are super important? Water, that's really the big one. The human body is about 65% water. All living things are made up of a majority of water, and so we cannot live without it. You can go much longer without food than you could go without water. You guys know water, it's made of hydrogen and oxygen, so you have two H's and one O. The oxygen has the higher electronegativity, and so the electrons are closer to it when they bond, and those shared electrons and just the way they pull give that bent shape or that angular shape to a water molecule. And what it does is it gives a water molecule two distinct areas, and that makes it, that's where we get this polar molecule name, because oxygen up here is going to have a negative charge always because the electrons are closer to it, whereas the hydrogens have a positive charge associated with them because they have fewer electrons. And so you essentially have this line right here with the two halves. So you have a polar molecule because of those two halves. That polarity means water can do lots of cool stuff. And that's really important because it can dissolve many things, and that ability to dissolve means it can move nutrients around in your body. So the shape of water, just real quick, a couple of things that it can do. Because of that shape, water is really good at bonding to itself. And when that happens, you have what is called hydrogen bonding. And hydrogen bonding helps water do three things that are very important to living organisms. First, they are cohesive. This cohesion is the attraction between water molecules. This is what gives water a surface tension. And so it's the reason that water beads up on, like on like a wax surface, like if you've waxed the car and you spray water on it, it beads up. Water also is adhesive, which means it will stick to other polar molecules, and so it will cling to surfaces. This is very important for plants because the inside of the plant roots, the veins of the plant, are polar, and so water will cling to it, and then because it's clinging to itself, it ends up kind of pulling itself up the roots. That's how water gets all the way from the deepest root all the way up to the very top of the tree, is this working together of adhesion and cohesion. The other one, the lower density in its solid form. Most liquids, as they turn from a liquid to a solid, become more compact and dense, and they will sink in their own liquid. Ice floats on water. And this is really important because in colder climates, when ponds or lakes freeze over, the ice will float on top. And not only does that mean it's not sinking down and crushing everything beneath it and then the whole thing becoming a solid, but you form a layer of ice on top of the water, and it acts as an insulator, keeps the water underneath a little warmer, and is important to the fish that are in there and the plants that may be down there. Okay, now carbon chemistry. So we have about 16 elements in our bodies, and carbon's the big one. Everything that is called an organic compound contains carbon. And so technically an organic compound is where you have carbon that is bonded to oxygen or nitrogen or hydrogen, and then a few select metals, nonmetals. So carbon's a big deal. It's unique because it can form 4 bonds at once. Most things will form fewer bonds than that. It can bond to itself. Other things can do that, so it's not that huge. It does form stable compounds with hydrogen. It can form different types of bonds, single, double, or triple, and that's what those structures down at the bottom are. And so you've got the single, double, triple bonds noted down there. It can also form rings. There are at least, and I'm sure there are way more than this by now, 50 million different compounds in living organisms that are carbon-based, that form structures within the cell. They work as enzymes, they store energy. So we are carbon-based life forms. Okay, so now there are 4 carbon compounds. The first one are carbs, everyone's favorite as far as diet goes, and they contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. This is what plants make in their simple form, and this is what we eat. This is what we're after when we eat plants. They're also found in the shells of insects, crustaceans. So they're big kind of for different reasons in different organisms. So now the simple carbohydrates are called sugars, and the most important sugar is glucose. I said it a couple slides back when we were talking about the energy stuff. Glucose is a 6-carbon ring that your cells use for energy. That's its shape right down there at the bottom. And so we consume other simple sugars that are similar to glucose and very complex, carbohydrates. But the main thing that our body will end up kind of working it towards through chemical reactions is glucose. Okay, it's the big one. Now, lipids. Lipids are kind of a nice way of saying fat. And so they are important because water can't dissolve them. Because if everything in our body would dissolve in water, we would just be a puddle. So we have to have some things that won't dissolve, and that's our lipids. Lipids are a 3-carbon base, so that's that kind of light blue chain over here. Here's the 3-carbon base, and then they have long chains of carbon and hydrogen that are attached to each of the 3 carbons. And they are what make the lipids insoluble. And so they can store energy. Fats in animals and people are stored energy. Oils in plants are stored energy. Unsaturated versus saturated, you may have heard those. Unsaturated fats contain a double or a triple bond, at least one somewhere in their carbon chains, and saturated fats only have single bonds. So these are important in your cell structures, they're important in your diet. It is important to eat some fats. You do need them in your diet, but you don't want it to be overwhelmingly made up of lipids. All right, proteins. So proteins are a big deal also because they make up a lot of our kind of our bulk. Your muscles are made up of proteins, your hair, your blood, your skin, and they are made up of organic compounds. There's a carbon in there called amino acids. And amino acids have 4 parts. An amine group, which I have circled in red on the picture, a carboxylic acid group, which is the blue, a hydrogen, and then an R group. The R group can be lots of different groups, or an atom or a group of atoms, and this is where you get the different types of amino acids. If you take a biochemistry class, you'll learn some of the different R groups. Now, amino acids are joined together in these long chains to make up the proteins, and they're joined when you have a reaction between the amine group of one amino acid and the carboxylic acid group of another amino acid. And notice when they bond, an H is given up from the amine and an OH is given up from the carboxylic acid, and so you have OH plus H, you get 2 H's and an O, and so this forms water. And so it's a very common reaction, and they can form chains that are several hundred amino acids long. The bond that is formed between them, between each different amino acid, is called a peptide bond. Okay, we're almost done. So last thing, nucleotides. This is our last carbon compound. You don't see any C's on this page, but everywhere that you have like these little, the little points on those shapes, there are carbons there. So just kind of know that. Nucleotides are a big deal because they make up your nucleic acid, your DNA and your RNA. And they also are made of various parts. You have a base that contains nitrogen that I circled in green, a sugar, the blue, and then the phosphate groups, which are in the red. So they are something that we'll talk way more about when we talk about DNA and its function and what it does in the cells and all that stuff. But so nucleotides also form chains. They also are bonded from one group to another. The base group on one and the phosphate group on another will bond together, release an H and an OH to form water. And you have these very long chains that can be single, that can be the double-stranded helix like we talked about with the shape of DNA. And that is the chemical instruction for the function of cells. This is what makes you, you. Okay, so that's chapter 2. Lots of chemistry, lots of basic stuff from last year. I hope you got it all. Bye, guys.